If you've never used React Query before and you watch this video all the way to the end, I guarantee you're gonna walk away with probably one of the best tools that you can have for specifically for data fetching, as well as maintaining that server state, caching, de-duping, optimistic updates, background refreshes. All of that stuff is handled by React Query, and we're gonna cover every single one of them. Data fetching in React sucks. I very much agree with this sentiment. If you think about it, when you're working with an API, for example, on a React application, there's so many things that you kind of have to track, right? So for example, you probably need to track loading state, because sometimes data takes a while to come back to the client. Sometimes you also need to track error states. You never know, maybe a user loses internet connection, or maybe your server is down. There could be so many things that goes wrong. And then on top of that, you also have to think about things like caching and de-duping. Especially when maybe you have users on a mobile application, you want to watch out for using too much of their data, right? Because they probably don't want you to use too much of their data. Another problem with server state is, as they kind of describe here, is it's fundamentally different from client state, right? What do we mean by that? So client state are things like, is a modal open or closed? What is the current value of this form field? Those things that are fundamentally just maintained on the client, whereas server state is usually something that is persisted remotely. It's not under your control. There could be other clients that's manipulating that data. So if you're trying to create an application that is, always up to date with the correct information, or the most up-to-date information, there's quite a bit more logic for you to add in your application. So what we're going to learn in this video today is React Query, which is a library that specifically solves a lot of these problems. It handles a lot of that server state management that you need to take care of, and it does that in a very simple way that does not require a lot of configuration. All right, what we're gonna do in this tutorial is we're gonna create a basic application that a client app which communicates to a server and does a couple, basic CRUD operations. I have a very basic users CRUD here that I made from another video, but you can see you can create users, you can get users, you can update users, your typical CRUD. And the users it only has a pretty basic data model. It just has a string name and details field. So first thing we're gonna do is, with React Query, you have to install React Query itself. And I already have your typical basic create React app application that I'm just gonna install React Query on. And in addition to that, I'm also gonna add Axios, which is a really good HTTP client library, or you can use Fetch if you prefer that. I personally like Axios. So I'm just gonna install those two. All right, once that's finished installing, the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna create an API file. I'm gonna call this users API.js, and I'm just gonna import Axios in here. All right, with that imported, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a Axios instance that simply has the base URL of that users API that I have running locally, and then from that we can create our API methods. So for example, I want to create a get users function here that simply returns api.get/users, right? So it does localhost 3000/users because it's using this instance with the base URL. And then with Axios, usually it returns a response within data. So I'm just gonna return that directly. So I'm gonna do .then rest.data. I'm also going to add one for getting the user by ID, which is just /user/ID, and we pass in the ID as an argument. And then finally, I'm also going to add one for updating the user, which simply kind of similar thing. It just takes the ID and we pass in the fields of the updated user. So for example, if we were to update the user's name or the user's details, and notice that we changed the HTTP method here to put. And similarly for all three of these guys, we just return rest.data. So that's what we're effectively going to try and build in this tutorial. Is we're going to have a list of users, and then we want to be able to select individual users and view their details, which will use this API call to get their specific details. And then, eventually we'll also write a little bit of logic to do some updating, So this is kind of a snapshot of some basic CRUD. All right, now that we have that out of the way, I'm actually going to go into index.js, which is the very root of my React application. And what I'm going to add here is an import from React Query. I'm going to import QueryClient and the QueryClient provider. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new QueryClient. And don't worry, I'll explain this in a little bit. And then we're going to wrap our entire application with a provider. So this QueryClient kind of acts as, if you think about it, as the data manager for all of the things that comes back from our queries, things that need to be cached. Any data that comes back really will be kind of handled by this QueryClient behind the scenes. And we're going to see some examples of how to also manage that ourselves as we go through this tutorial. And another thing that I recommend every React application that's using React Query to have is the Devtools, which is very nice and useful. And you simply add it like so, right? Just put it side by side your application, and you'll see this in action in a little bit. If we run our application from here and open the browser on localhost 3000, what you'll see is just a basic, pretty much empty application that just says learn React Query, and you'll see this little flower thing in the bottom. That's the Devtools that we added. And when you click into that, it'll give us some information about what are the queries that it's making. We'll take a look at that. We'll take a closer look at this as we use it later. All right, so we got a running application. What do we need to do first? So we talked about maybe creating a list of users, right? So let's start with that. So from here, I'm going to create a new file called users.js, and I'm just going to initialize this to a basic component function. And here's how we're going to do API calls. First, you import useQuery from React Query, and then we're also going to import our API from our users API. Remember that we added a get users method in here, so we're going to take advantage of that in a second. And the way you use useQuery is pretty simple. You just do like this. So we're going to destructure data, which is the response, and then we're going to do useQuery. And then the first thing you have to provide here is a key. And this is going to be the key in the cache. Right now, it's probably not going to make a ton of sense, but you'll see why this is important later on. But basically, you need to provide a key that differentiates this query from all the other queries in your application. And this is going to be useful later on for things like caching and invalidating queries and stuff like that. The next thing we're going to pass in here is the API call that we're going to use. So this is any async function, it returns a promise. In our case, we want to do get users. And actually, I forgot to export get users, so I need to make sure to do that. All right, so from here, let's imagine that I'm simply trying to list out all the users that I have. So maybe let's just do a basic, if we have data, let's map through it, and let's take each user and print out their name. So we're going to do map each user to, let's do an li element here. And remember that you have to provide keys for lists. So we're going to use the user.id here. And then within this, we're just going to print the user.name. And so we can see this in action. We're going to import our users component. And we're going to put that in our root app component. Now let's actually take a look at the browser and see what we have. You can see that I have Mumbo and Dumbo. And just to kind of prove to you that this is coming from the API, if I go to my API over here, localhost 3001, if I do /users, I get back Mumbo, Dumbo. You'll see that there's ID1, ID2, and they each have their own details, which we'll show in a little bit. Right, so that's pretty basic. It works great. And we can also show the Devtools in action here. If I refresh, you'll see that it lists out by key the query that we made. And it also, this is kind of think of it as a replacement for the network tab in your browser. So it can show you the data, right? And it can also show you the different options about it and the different states that it currently has. And in here, you can even trigger things like, maybe you want to refetch the data to kind of just see what happens. And there's stuff here about stale and fetching that we'll cover in a little bit. All right, so what else can you do with this? And back in our users file, another thing that this useQuery returns actually is an isLoading property, which if you can use that to print out loading states, you know, like your spinners and stuff like that. So for example, we can just return a basic string of loading users, right? And let me refresh. And that happens very quickly. So let's see if we can simulate some slow network speed. We're gonna do in the network tab, we're gonna add slow 3G. So this is kind of gonna simulate as if I have really slow internet connection, which is gonna allow us to see that loading state in action. So imagine, you know, maybe someone's on a 3G network on a phone, you know, you want to make sure you show those loading spinners. All right, so with that slow 3G enabled there, what you'll notice when I refresh the page is it's going to take a little bit more time, and it's going to show us our loading users for a couple seconds here, and then it loads in our data, right? So this is a pattern that pretty much any client application should have, that React Query kind of just handles for you. Same thing with if you have some errors. So there's also an isError, which also there is an error object here as well. So for example, maybe that the server goes down. So for example, you can also add another if here, and let's just display a basic error message. Right, so let's imagine that, actually let's go ahead and turn off, I'm going to turn off my API server, my local API server. And if we refresh our application here, you're going to see that it's going to try and load the users again, and then eventually it's going to fail because the server is down, right? And it's going to tell me something went wrong. And there's also something to notice on the network tab actually, is you'll notice that it actually automatically tried to attempt retrying the call automatically 3 or 4 times here, and only until it was done retrying that it says that it's in an error state. So there's also another thing that I haven't talked about it yet, is that it automatically tries to retry for you those API calls that fail. That's something that you can configure, by the way, but by default it's going to try a couple times. So for example, you know, as an example of maybe some configuration, I can add retry false here, and what's going to happen here when I refresh is it's almost immediately going to go into the error state, and you'll notice that it didn't retry, right? So those are things that you'll have to understand with React Query, is that there's a couple of things that are it tries to figure out what's a good default for everyone, but it does give you also the ability to configure those defaults, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those defaults are in a little bit. But first we got to focus on just the basic fundamentals here, right? Just so you know, I turned the server back on so that we can start going forward with the rest of this tutorial. So this is really the typical structure for a basic useQuery usage, right? You just provide your API call, you provide a key, and then that gives you back data, isLoading, isError, and a couple other things, but those are the main ones that you really need to keep track of. And then you'll almost always really have an isLoading or isError check at the top here, so that you can react to it. And then if it gets past this, that means that the data came back and you can go ahead and display it. Now there are other details. For example, this error object is going to contain, you know, the details of that error. So if you want to have some custom error handling, you know, you can take advantage of that value. And then React Query also supports error boundaries. Actually, there's a property you can turn on that will automatically, just if there's an error in the API call, it'll rethrow that error, and then, you know, you can handle that using your error boundaries. That's a little bit outside of the scope of this video, so maybe I'll cover that in another video. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. All right, anyway, so let's move forward here. The next thing we're gonna do is, so we have a list of users. What I want to do is I kind of want to split the page between a list of users and in a detail view, you know. So I want to be able to click one user, and then as you click one user, it shows the details of that user on the second half of the screen. All right, so the way we're going to be able to pull this off is by adding some some local state tracking here. So I'm going to add an import for useState, and then I'm just going to add a user ID and a set user ID here, right? Your basic use state. And then we're going to pass down set user ID in here so that our user list has the ability to set the user ID that we selected. So really this is your selected user. So then in our users component, I'm going to add that in there. And then what I want to do is maybe I'll add a button in here to do, let's just say view, right? So I have a new button here, and then on click, that's where I'm going to set the ID. So set user ID to the ID of this current user. And just to make sure that's working, let's just print out our current user ID selection. All right, so when I click one of these, it's going to show me 1, 2, you see over there. I'm going to add a little bit of CSS to clean this up a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wrap the users list in a div, and I'm going to add a little bit of styling here. Let's move that users list within that wrapper, right? So I'm just adding a little bit of padding. I'm going to set it to just about 1/3 of the page, and I'll add a border right so that we can kind of see a divider there. And then let me make another wrapper for the details section. We'll wrap our user ID in that. And then similarly, this one, we're, add some padding there as well, but we'll set it to take up the rest of the space. All right, so let's create our users details component. So what this component is going to do is it's going to take that user ID, and then it's going to make a call to our API to get the specific user and the rest of its details. So this should be taking in a user ID prop. And then similarly, we're going to import useQuery, and we're also going to import our API. And then same thing, we're going to do data equals useQuery. And then remember, the first thing we have to pass in here is a query key. From the users.js, we just passed in a basic string, but for a specific user query, we need to provide a more specific query key here. For example, something that utilizes the user ID. So we're actually going to pass in here an array, and it's going to be a combination of the string user and that user ID. And again, this will be very important when it comes to things like caching, which we're going to talk about in just a second here. So in this case, we have an API. Again, just to remind, we have a getUser API method here that we just need to pass an ID in. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to do a function here, and we're going to do API.getUser and make sure to pass in the user ID. Now, first of all, our application, the way it's currently set up is there's not always going to be a user ID selected. So we need to add a little bit of a catch here of if there's no user ID selected, then return, let's just provide a message of select a user. And then similar to the users list, we're going to add an isLoading state here. Again, ideally in a lot of these, you really should be adding, isLoading and isError. Typically in my own applications, I would probably have the loading state there all the time, but use error boundaries for error handling. And then what I also like to do is I usually rename this data to be a little bit more specific, right? In this case, it's really the user. And once you have that down here, we're just going to display the user's name and details. All right, so now that we have a basic user details component, we're going to bring that into our application, similar to how we did with the users list. And we're just going to put that in our second div in here. And then remember that we need to pass in the user ID that was selected. All right, let's take a look at how our browser looks so far. So we got our list on the left, and then on the right, it tells us to select a user because we didn't select anything. If I select Mumbo, it's going to say it's loading user details, and then eventually the data comes back. All right, we got our name and details over here. Now you'll notice it's hard to see here, so let me expand a little bit. But you notice we have some errors here because it's actually trying to call the get user by ID a little too early, even before it had an ID available. So why is that? That's because when you have useQuery like this, it's immediately gonna try and make that call. And there's one way to prevent that. You can add an options object here. So for example, if I add enabled false, this is gonna completely prevent it from running. But we still want it to actually run only when we have a user ID provided, right? So what we're gonna do here is we're actually gonna turn this into a dynamic value of Boolean user ID, right? So as long as we have a truthy user ID, this is gonna work. Obviously it won't work for an ID of 0, but let's just assume we don't have that because our first user in a database has an ID of 1. All right, so just to be sure that this is all working, back in our application, you'll notice that when I select Mambo, it's gonna load user details and then eventually the data comes in, right? And looking at our network tab, no problems. Now let's talk about a little bit about some of those default configurations or settings that React Query provides for you. So in the documentation in React Query, there's this section called important defaults that you absolutely should read through. It talks about how it has some pretty aggressive but sane defaults. What are those things? So that includes, for example, we slightly talked about it where it automatically tries to retry 3 times, right? That's one of the defaults. It also says that inactive queries are garbage collected after 5 minutes. What does that mean? So for example, in our application, if we open up our Devtools here, you'll notice that when we have Mambo, it adds it to our query client with the key of user and then the ID of 1, right? And you'll see that here too, it has the data Mambo. But what happens when we switch over to Dumbo? It's gonna make another call and it's gonna update the query to be user with the ID of 2, right? And it has that data of Dumbo. But what happens is that data that we had before is kind of cached for 5 minutes. You'll notice that it's gray because it's being marked as inactive. When something goes into inactive, by default, after 5 minutes, that data is going to get deleted. But if for some reason, maybe the user goes back to that page. So for example, if we go back to Mambo, it's automatically gonna, 1, mark that as active again, and then 2, it's gonna do a background refresh. Plus, it's also gonna take advantage of what the previously cached data was. So for example, you'll notice that as I click between Mambo and Dumbo here, it's very quick, right? There's no loading state because it's taking advantage of the data that was currently or that was previously saved in our cache, which doesn't get garbage collected until after 5 minutes while it's in an active state. So for example, if I just sit on Mambo for 5 minutes, eventually this data from Dumbo is going to get garbage collected and it's going to be deleted. But if I go back to it within 5 minutes, it's going to reuse that data. And then when I switch to it, you'll also see that it's going to go into fetching. So first it's going to grab back the cache and it's going to show the user, here's the old data that you have. And then behind the scenes, it's going to fetch to make sure that it has the current data and it's going to update the entire thing, right? So to better kind of articulate this, there's actually another property that you can bring in here called is fetching. And just so that we can see this working in action, we're going to add, if it's fetching, we're just going to display a message that says it's background refreshing, right? So let's try to see how this works, because I don't know if I explained it well, but as I kind of go back and forth, you'll see that again, I'm able to switch between the two very quickly because it's utilizing the data that's already there. So it makes the application very snappy almost, because first it shows old data and then it does a background refresh to make sure it has the most recent data, and then when that comes back, it updates the UI again. Right? So as I click, it shows background refreshing, and then eventually it stops, right? And you can see the calls being made as well on the network tab. There's also a couple different places where it tells you other situations that might trigger a background refresh. So for example, one of the main ones that's easy to demo here is window refocus. So for example, when I click back into my tab here, you'll notice that it's going to say background refreshing, right? Let me do that again. I'm out of focus, I'm back in focus, and it's refetching. So every time it goes back to the application, it's gonna try to get it tries to make sure that the data is up to date, basically, which is a very nice feature. Again, a lot of this stuff, I recommend you read through it to understand a lot of the other defaults. They are, like it says, they're aggressive but sane defaults, and I would agree with that. But know that you can configure a lot of these stuff. All right, so where do we go from here? So far, all we've done so far is just basic reading data, right? What if you want to manipulate data? Remember that we also added a method here for updating the user. So that's another use case that we're going to try and code out in this tutorial. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file here called user form. And this is going to include basically just a form of the fields that we can update for a user. Gonna add a little padding here, and basically we're just gonna make a basic form. And actually, before we get started, let's kind of set up our state management. So for this user form to be able to do updates, it first needs to have the values of the original user, right? So we likely should be passing the user in here as a prop, and then we're just gonna add a basic use state hook like so that we have a copy of the user fields, and then we're going to be able to manage those fields from this form, and then we'll add some on submit logic in a little bit. I'm also going to add a basic handle change, so that our input as a user is typing into it, and we're able to update the fields object. And then I'm also going to add an event handler for submit that we're going to pass into our form over here on submit, handle submit. Right, and all that's doing now is it's gonna print out the fields. All right, so what are we gonna put it in our form? So first of all, let's add an input box for the user's name. There we go. So it's just a basic input with name, and it has the value of fields at name. On change, it's gonna use that handler we made up here, and then it just has some basic styling to set the width and stuff like that. All right, next we're gonna add a basic text area that allows us to update the details of the user. And then finally, we're gonna add a submit button, right, for us to be able to trigger this on submit. By the way, I'm speeding through this because I assume you know how to write forms in React. I kind of want to make sure we focus on the React query bit specifically, but if this is completely new to you, the React documentation does have really good docs on how to do forms. All right, now that we have a user form, we're gonna import that in our user details file. And something we need to add in here is basically I want to be able to switch between the details and the editing form, maybe using a button. So we're gonna add some state in here again. So bring back the use state hook, and I'm just gonna add a basic state here that is a boolean of is editing, which we're gonna able to kind of toggle on and off using a button. So I'm just gonna replace this background refresh message. I think you guys get the point there, right? And I'm just gonna replace that with a button that kind of allows us to toggle between editing and viewing details. And then using the value of that is editing boolean, we're just gonna switch back and forth between our user form. All right, so if it's editing, we're gonna do user form and make sure to pass in our user. Otherwise, we're just gonna print out what we had before. All right, and actually, while we're here, we might as well pass in our set is editing here, because the form itself needs to be able to toggle that state, right? So for example, once we submit, we're gonna make an API call to do that update. And then when it comes back, we need to be able to toggle the editing back to false so that we show the details. Let's take a look at what the UI looks like so far in the browser. So when we select Mumbo, it's gonna load in that side. And then now we have an edit here. And when we click edit, it's just gonna bring us that form. And we can kind of toggle that state from details to form. Now, right now, our form doesn't really do anything. If I hit save here, it doesn't actually make that call to the API yet. It just console logs our details, our user object. So this is where React Query comes in again, which we're going to introduce the useMutation hook, right? So useQuery is obviously for any kind of get call that you need to make, and useMutation is for anything that has to do with, you know, changing or updating data in your database or wherever else. So basically probably any write events that you need to do will use useMutation. So the API of useMutation is kind of pretty similar, right? So you can also do a destructuring object like this, which has properties is loading, and you can do useMutation, and then you simply pass in your API call. So in our case, it's update user, which we actually need to import, and we forgot to do that. Now you might be wondering, how do we trigger this mutation to run? So in this case, right, the mutation shouldn't necessarily run immediately like a query does. We actually want the mutation to trigger when we want it to. So for example, in our case, we probably want to trigger that down here, right, in the handle submit. So what you can actually destructure out of here is a mutate function. We're going to take that and we're going to call that down here, and we'll pass the fields in here. So the first argument that you pass in here ultimately is what gets passed down to your API call. So for example, in our case here, we're really passing down the user object, which has, you know, the ID and the name and the details, which is why here we're just doing mutate fields, right? It kind of just forwards it down. So that kind of makes the API really nice and clean. And in the is loading state here, you can use that as a way to tell, you know, another kind of similar to our query stuff, right? If you want to show the user that, hey, we're saving this data right now, wait a little bit, and we'll tell you when it's done, you can use that is loading state. So for example, maybe we want to do something like, if is loading, we're going to say saving your changes. And actually, I forgot my return here. All right, let's take a look at how this works. So back in our application, let's select Mambo, and I'm going to edit, and I'm going to update the details here to something new, and I'm going to hit save, and you'll see it goes into saving your changes and then goes back to our form. But there's a problem here. Notice that when I hit cancel and go back to the details view, we have stale data. It still has mambo, right? But if I, you know, click out of it and back into Mambo, it should automatically update because of the background refresh. But that's not really the behavior that we want, right? We ideally want that to update right away. So how can we improve that? There's two strategies you can use here. The simple one is we can tell useQuery that, hey, after this mutation is done, invalidate my previous query for this user so that it automatically right away makes a new call to update that data. How do we do that? So the way to do that is simply you can pass in a configuration object in here, and you can there's like different hooks that you can use. So for example, there is an onSuccess that you can provide, and onSuccess we can do a couple useful things in here. So another thing, right, is we said that we passed in set is editing earlier. We probably want to set the editing to false on success. Yeah, right. Once it's done saving our data, we want to go back to the details view, not the form view. So that's one thing. And then also we can do some trigger the old data to be updated, right? So how do we do that? Well, remember that our application is kind of wrapped with a query client. You can get access to that query client using useQueryClient. So I'm going to add another hook here, and I'm going to import useQueryClient from React Query. So this allows us to kind of have access to that cache, that query client. You know, this query client can do all sorts of things, like for example, if you want to optimistically update the data, or maybe you just want to get data that's in that cache and use it somewhere else. You know, it effectively acts like a global store if you want to think about it that way. But one of the things you can do with this is you can do query client dot invalidate queries, and we can provide here the key that we want to invalidate. So in our case, we want to invalidate the user with the user ID that we have here, right? Let's take a look at how that behaves differently now. All right, so back in the application, if I go into edit mode and update the details here, I can change this to, I got updated, and I'm going to hit save, and this is going to load for a little bit, but notice what happens. As soon as I hit save, it's still going to show me the old thing, but notice that it immediately got updated to what we updated to, because it immediately triggered an update, and we didn't need to click in and out of Mumbo to trigger it, right? It got updated. And because we had the throttling here enabled, that kind of made it more obvious. On a really fast internet speed, people won't even notice, it'll just update automatically. So let's try that again. All right, I'm gonna hit save, and it almost seems instantaneous, right? Because it loaded, it saved, and then it came back and updated the data. But that's probably not always the best thing to do. That's an easy way to kind of get around it. So let's bring back our slow 3G here. Another thing you can do is what's called optimistic updating, which is basically you're going to update the data right away for the user. So it makes it seem as if even if their internet speed was slow, it comes off like their change got saved right away. So how do we do that? So back in our code, what we're going to add here is an onMutate function, and we're going to use the QueryClient again to set the data, right? What this is going to do, it's going to immediately replace the data that was there. So using the key that we have, which identifies the data that we have cached for this user, we're simply going to pass in updated user. And this updated user is going to come from the argument here. So this updated user object is basically what you passed in to mutate here, right? So we're going to basically tell the user, or show the user as if the thing that they hit saved on, immediately what they typed out is what's going to be on the screen. So over here in the QueryClient, we're basically looking at what's the old cache data. We're going to immediately replace that with what got submitted on the form. The other thing we're going to do here is we're going to move this set is editing false up and onMutate, because in this case we don't really need to wait for the loading to be done, right? We just want to show the user right away that hey, optimistically updated your data to this, like as if we told them that it happened right away. I also need to comment out this is loading state, just so you can kind of see the optimistic update happening in real time. So back in our application, when I go into edit mode and I switch to another change here, when I hit save, it immediately went back to the details view and the data is immediately up to date. And in the background, it's going to do the refetching, it's going to do the actual mutation, and eventually it's going to sync everything back up, right? Because I have on success here, I'm still saying that I'm invalidating the query, so that eventually, even though we optimistically updated, it's still going to background refresh for me. There's also other things you can do here, like for example, you obviously can't always assume that the API call is going to work, right? So there's a situation where if you optimistically update, what if it runs into an error? You technically should revert the data back to what it was originally. And there are some documentation on the React query site about how to do this. So if you search for the optimistic update section, you'll notice that there is a way for you to get the snapshot of the old data, and then you can kind of provide some context of what that old data was, and on error you can set the data back to what the snapshot was. And really quick before we wrap up here, one thing that I forgot to mention is that you can also just decide to set the data on success. That way you kind of don't have to worry about the scenario of what happens if it doesn't work, right? Like if there was an error in that request. So what we can do is we can actually also move the set query data down here on success, and this actually also returns the response via the first argument here. So we'll take that data and replace this updated user here, or you can use that same name if you wanted to, but I wanted to call out that this is different. This is the actual response data. This is different from the request data that we're sending out, right? So this is what it comes back with after the request completes. So if we're doing that, and assume that we're getting the right data back, you don't really need to invalidate it anymore. So we can get rid of this. And then just to kind of bring back our commented out changes here, let's bring back our loading, because this one we actually do want to show in this case that, hey, your thing is being saved right now, wait a little bit. And we also actually need to move this set as editing down here, because remember that if we're not in editing mode, we're no longer in this user form, which means that it's not going to show us our saving changes, it's loading message. So we're just going to completely get rid of this and mutate since we're not using it. So again, to summarize, when we hit save on the form, it's going to send that request, and then it's going to use mutation. It's going to say is loading is true. It should show our message, and then eventually the response comes back, and we save that response data into set query data, which allows us to update our cache, our data store, and then it all should look pretty good. So back in Mumbo, I've got slow 3G enabled. So I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to change the details to something else again. I'm going to hit save. You should see that's going to say saving your changes, and then it comes back and the response is used as the actual data itself. So this is probably the primary way that I would recommend most people do it, is just utilize the data that comes back on success to update your QueryClient data. But if you have requirements to make your application seem a little bit more snappy, you can do optimistic updating. You just need to watch out for the scenario where what if your API request fails. Make sure you handle that. All right, so that's really it. That's the basics of React Query. If you know how to do useQuery and useMutation, that's honestly 90% of it. The rest of it is just probably changing some settings on when things trigger or not trigger, or maybe your different caching. If you want to change how long something is cached and stuff like that, those are all configurable with React Query. There's other things you can do, like what if you want to do dependent queries, right? If you want to have two queries kind of run one after another and stuff like that. Lots of good stuff in the documentation here that I don't think I need to cover, because it's already well documented, and this video was really meant to just be kind of an introduction, right? But it has some docs on a lot of the things that you would expect a library like this to have, right? So like, how do you do pagination? How do you do infinite queries, right? So for example, if you have like infinite scrolling, lots of good stuff in here that I recommend checking out. I think one important thing to discuss here is to kind of going back to what we started with, is kind of what's the point of React Query, right? The point of React Query is that a lot of the server stuff has completely different concerns from your client stuff. So again, like we talked about, you have to think about the de-duping, you got to think about caching and stuff like that, background refreshing. You absolutely can do this stuff with your basic, use state and use effect or Redux, and it's probably gonna be really complicated, and you're gonna have to add a lot of extra logic, because those solutions were not made specifically for making API calls and maintaining data from your server. So React Query is specifically made for that purpose. So if you think about it, in a typical React application, if you take a lot of the server specific state that you usually would maintain in Redux or something similar, and if you let React Query manage that state, you'll find that the remaining state that you have, the client specific state that you have, is actually going to be really small, that you might not even need Redux anymore. You can just use something smaller like your basic useState, useReducer, or zustand or Jotai, some of the small libraries that I've been making videos about recently. So this is React Query is a tool that you absolutely, in my opinion, should have in your tool set, because it just makes all of this API server state data management extremely simple, and then it makes the rest of your state management code simpler as well. Anyways guys, that's it for this video. If you found that to be a good video, make sure to leave a thumbs up. And if you want to see more of this type of content, React, Node, JavaScript stuff, that's all the stuff that I make. So make sure to subscribe if you want to see more. With that said, I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.